what a fantastic novel this is. Judy, this novel felt very autobiographical. Was it? Is it?
Well, yes and no. It's autobiographical from the point of view, I think, that Sujan's heart is my heart. But the events of the book are fiction. My mother did not have an affair. I don't have a younger brother. Although many people do ask me, and what happened to your baby brother? Well, I don't have a baby brother. And I didn't grow up in a restaurant, but I did grow up in a small town. So I know what it's like to grow up in a small town. I know what it's like to be the only Chinese non-white kid in that environment.
And your father didn't own a restaurant.
He did not own a restaurant.
He owned?
A laundry. He owned a hand laundry.
So, as a child of immigrants, this book really resonated with me, even though it's about a Chinese family and I'm Italian. In what way do you think your book speaks to children of immigrants?
Well, I like to think that it speaks to children of immigrants, but then I also like to think that it speaks to all of us, because I think that in many ways it's a book that, even though it might talk about the particular, I hope it also addresses the universal. Because is there anyone out there who's never felt sorrow, or who's never felt betrayed, or who has never felt on the outside looking in? Is there anyone out there who's never felt that, or who's never had that sensation of having your nose pressed up against a glass, watching other people have a good time? Maybe there are people out there, but, you know, and so I like to think that there are elements in the book that everyone can identify with. But speaking specifically about immigrant children, yes, there are things that immigrant children have had to do that I suppose people who have parents who speak English and who have an ease in the society in which they live don't have to deal with. Like, I know that my husband did not have to negotiate a mortgage for his parents when he was 17 or 18. And
write checks.
Write checks.
Call Bell Canada.
Call Bell Canada. You weren't struggling with a tax form at age 11.
That's right.
You know, and I remember having to do all the orders at Eaton's, and I remember having to bring them home, and if my mother and my sister liked them, fine. If they didn't like them, I was the one stuck taking them back. And I remember one situation, I was telling a friend of mine, oh dear, I'm probably giving away trade family secrets, and and somebody in my family is going to be arrested for fraud, I'm sure. But there was a situation in my family where my sister had ordered a sweater from Eaton's catalog. It was a beautiful pink sweater. And when it arrived, I went and picked it up and I brought it back, and she decided that it was too much money. So I took it back and I got the money back, but the money that I got back was a lot less than what she had thought. So obviously the lady at the store had charged us the wrong amount. And both my mother and my sister got really mad at me because they said, "What? You could get this sweater for half the price and you didn't even know it?" And so they sent me back to Eaton's and I had to re-buy the sweater. But by this time the lady had realized her mistake and charged me the right price. And so I brought it back, having paid the right price. And at this time, they decided that, well, at the right price, they didn't want it after all. And so again, I was sent back to take the sweater back at the right price. And so there wasn't any consideration of sort of the fact that I might be absolutely wanting to crawl under a rock in front of the lady at Eaton's. But anyway, I mean, I think those were the sorts of things that just about every
very familiar
immigrant kid went through.
Some of the things you talk about in the book where you describe the racism that Sujan faced, and you know the girl calling her names, that kind of thing. You can't believe that it actually happened in Canada, but that was a reality for children of immigrants.
Oh yeah, I think that those sorts of things, even after many years, the sting lingers.
Yeah.
You can still feel it. Yeah.
Because you were different.
Yeah.
Or Sujan was different.
Yeah. Well, I was different.
You are Sujan. Okay, so Judy, there's a big secret at the center of the novel that everyone knows. Everyone in the book, all the characters know about it. but it's never acknowledged openly. So what does that say about this Eastern tradition of saving face?
Oh, I think safe face in the Eastern tradition is all important. It's all I have to do is look at the Beijing Olympics, and do you remember that perfect child they had singing the national anthem? And then we later found out that it was a physically less perfect child who was equally as cute as far as I was concerned, who did the singing. And the physically perfect child was the one who was told to mouth the words. And so I think that whole notion of face and presenting a perfect veneer to the world is very much a part of Eastern culture. And so I think that's why it remained an open secret.
And Su-Jen's mother, she was one of the least likable characters in the book. But at the end, I felt so sorry for her. Who was she? What were you trying to say with this character? And how does she represent women from that culture?
Well, I don't know if it's so much what I was trying to say as what she was trying to say. Because I think that as a writer, I don't always set out to say this or say that. The characters evolve and they end up saying things. And I don't want to give the impression that I'm just some kind of conduit, but often it does seem to happen that way, that the characters take on a life of their own and they have something to say to you through me. And I started out writing a book about isolation and loneliness and the effects of that, but I think that this woman brought a degree of complexity to it that I wasn't quite ready for.
She was very lonely, very isolated.
Yes.
She hated Canada. She pined for her life back home. Mm-hmm. Can we tell the secret? Well, she had a lover.
Well, yes, she had a lover, but let's not tell who the lover was.
No, we won't. We won't say who the lover is. But she just seemed, she didn't seem to love Su-Jen as much as she sort of
as
was
she
selfish.
Should have.
Yeah, and
Yes.
as much as she loved herself, really.
Mm-hmm. But she's probably not the first selfish person in fiction.
Yeah. And you were talking about how these characters they do tend to take on a life of their own. And
yes.
There's a character in the book that dies. I'm not going to tell you who. And I said to you, when I first met you, I said, why did that person have to die? Why did that person have to die?
I think it speaks to the randomness of life. I think that life is not fair. And I learned that very, very early on.
And you said it was almost inevitable, that just the way the character was.
Well, so often it seems that in fiction, the people whom you love are doomed.
Mm. And she did seem doomed.
Yeah, there was, there was something about her very early on that did seem doomed, and I remember wanting to save her. I kept trying to save her. I kept trying to write the book in such a way that she would be saved, but it never worked. It just finally came that she was one of life's tragedies.
And yeah, that's one of the many tragedies in the book. But it's interesting, you contrast the sheer isolation of Irvine, which stands in for Acton, Ontario,
yes.
and its smell of the tannery and
Yes.
everything. And then this joyfulness that exists in Chinatown, in Toronto. And whenever the parents go back, they have such a great time. They speak Chinese. They can buy their food and their herbs, and they go out for Chinese food, and they just seem to love being in that community. And I kept thinking, why didn't they just move to Toronto? Why did they have to stay in this kind of grim little town where they were so isolated and so different?
Well, I think there are a lot of Chinese people, and probably not just Chinese people, but probably a lot of people, I'll bet, in the audience who would not consider themselves entrepreneurs, you know, who I think that someone like Sujen's father, that if he had remained in China, he might have been a scholar, he might have been a teacher, he might have been a school teacher. He would have probably done something very, very different. But I think that in a place like Canada, his options were few. Canada was not a place that allowed the Chinese to enter the professions until much later. He didn't bring much formal education with him, and so his options were actually very, very few. And I think that for him, the notion of doing business in a big city where there was a lot of competition was probably more than what he could handle. And so often a lot of those people, they end up going into the small towns where they feel at least they can make some kind of a living, even if it's not a necessarily wealthy living or a rich living, but it's a living.
Because we've all been in those small towns where there is the one Chinese restaurant.
I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Pierre Burton who said that the Chinese restaurant in a small town is every bit as Canadian as the Prairie grain elevator and the churches in Quebec. So, and I think there is a truth to that.
And you know, they did make the food that the the Lofans ate.
The Chinese
they ate their own food. And it wasn't, they ate their own real Chinese food.
That's right.
And they made this food that they thought the Canadians wanted.
Yes, well, we never ate off the menu.
And you'll find that, you know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's
chicken balls and fried rice.
It's quite true. Often the menus from one small town restaurant to another small town restaurant are almost interchangeable. You'll find sweet and sour
chicken balls,
gai ding, combination dinner 1, 2, 3, and 4. You know, I mean, it's almost exactly the same, and it wasn't something that we as Chinese people ate. We always just thought of it as Lofan food.
But yet, you know, the Lofans going in there and
thought it was
eating,
Chinese food.
Oh, they thought it was so ethnic and so daring. In the book, there's a real theme of sacrifice. Do you think sacrifice has been sort of an antiquated notion in these days? You know, the father sacrificed everything to come to Canada. They lived in the tiniest of apartments above this restaurant. The mother sacrificed, you know, she loved to hear her opera and wear her pretty clothes, and she sacrificed all of that. Do you think that notion is sort of antiquated now?
Well, it certainly seems to be as I look around me. I mean, don't we live in an immediate gratification sort of society? I mean, if you haven't saved the money for it, just put it on your credit card, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I have to admit that I've subscribe to that. I can't sit up here and be sanctimonious and say that I'm like my parents, that I sacrifice this and sacrifice that. I tend to more or less live that kind of lifestyle, that if I need something, I just go out and get it. But on the other hand, I do find myself, and I'm only speaking very personally, that I do still carry that notion within me that says, well, I remember my parents both saying to me that you must be frugal with yourself in order to be generous with family and friends. And I think that that is a certain philosophy that I have carried with myself, because there is a tendency that if you're going to give anyone the short end of the stick, it's always myself rather than my children or my friends or, you know, whatever.
And there's longing is another theme in this book.
Yes.
Everyone longs.
That's because the Chinese adults, anyway, in the book aren't at home. They remain strangers in a strange land. It is Sujen who actually does become Canadian, and even if her parents are Canadian and contribute to Canadian society, they never feel entirely at home.
But even Soo-Jen, when she starts to encounter all the girls at school, she longs for their life. She
longs for their life,
Yeah.
but she longs to be Canadian. She doesn't long to be in another place.
Right.